Okay, so welcome to my originally software development process interview series, now just a regular interview series. So we're not going to be talking about software development process specifically in this one, but I'm here with a very special guest as always. This is Adam, who was a product manager who I worked with when I was working at Google, and someone I can easily say is the best product manager I ever worked with, but I will say maybe it's a little too easy to say that, but definitely someone who I respect a lot and look up to a lot in terms of, the product management side of things. He always actually understood the product, which I was quite impressed by, to be honest. And been working at Google a while, and I don't know, do you have any more introduction for me? That's a bad.
Yeah, well, thank you for the nice words. Yeah, so I just, by way of introduction, I've been at Google as a product manager for about 8 years now on a few different teams, and worked as a PM for, over 20 years now across maybe 4 or 5 companies.
It's pretty good experience. So we got to get right into it. I need some answers to some questions, but first I'm going to set the stage a little bit for the listeners. So I've been working at a small startup for, I think, 4 months, and I'm as a developer, I should say, and I ran out of work after about 3 months, and I had no features to implement. And I thought, oh, no problem. I'll just become a product manager and come up with work to do. So that's sort of the situation that I'm currently in, making progress on that front. But I think for my first question, sort of an introductory question a little bit, is I'm coming at this from the developer standpoint of I don't have any work to do, but I definitely get the sense that product managers do a lot more than just create new work for developers to do. Maybe I could just sort of ask, what do you imagine a product manager doing? What does a good product manager do, sort of in general?
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, the way I think about it is kind of like a funnel. Maybe that's not the right analogy, but at least it's a simple analogy where, at the top of the funnel, there's a lot of things your company could be doing, and you're obviously trying to narrow it down. And when you're at the top of the funnel, there's, the product manager can typically be a key kind of owner of that, definition of how we get from the very broad set of things we could be doing to get more narrow, right? What you were describing about kind of what features should we work on, I sort of think of that as, well, we've already made some macro decisions about our strategy, right? And I'll say in a moment what I mean by that. So we have kind of a strategy in mind already. Now we get down to the sort of further down the funnel of translating that strategy into kind of tangible, capabilities we want to go build. So I do think it's typically an important part of the PM's job is at the top of the funnel is working on strategy, right? Because and you could be, you can tell me if this is true, but at some companies, especially small companies, that might be very top down, where you might have a leader or a founder, let's say, or other kind of leadership that very clearly have articulated a particular strategy, and they're just expecting their teams to execute on it. In which case, you may not be in a position where you need to, at least right now, worry too much about that. But typically, as a PM, you are going to worry about that very basic questions like, what is the mission and strategy of the company, and how do I translate that into things we should be building and offering to the market? And so it's those basic questions like, who are our users? What are the other options that these users have to solve their problems today? If we're not going to solve them for them, what other options are there? Are there competitors that do the same things we do? Maybe the Venn diagram is the competitors have a small overlap with what we're trying to do, but it's important to understand what that overlap is, and can we do it better than the competitors? Or maybe there's really no competition. That's typically not true. Usually there's, if you thought there was no competition for what you're doing, there probably is. It's probably just, maybe it's not software. Maybe it's just some very manual process, right? So I do think that's kind of where the job starts, is defining the market you're going to go after, the users you're trying to target with your solutions, right? And then you get down to actually trying to be more specific about how we translate that into an actual product and features in that product, right?
Yeah, I think to respond, I think that's super useful. I think to give you a little more flavor about where we're at, we did close a pre-seed round and have like pretty large investors, and so they've sort of already signed on to a specific-ish or a relatively specific sort of strategy, like high-level strategy. And so to change it, we would need to like go back to the investors and like explain to them, because we have like a board now and stuff like that. So the strategy is defined. I think the thing that I've been struggling more with is actually implementing the strategy into something people can use, you know? So I think that it's interesting to see that you see the role of the product manager sort of going, you know, all the way to the top or all the way to the base of the company in terms of the basic value proposition. That's actually something that the, you know, product manager is super involved with. That's pretty interesting.
And there are other, to be honest, like the job can be even broader and typically is. Just to give you a flavor of like other things that we care about, and would be things like pricing strategies, like marketing, you know, and the level to which you as a PM need to get involved in things like that really depend on the size of the company and whether there are, you know, other functions in the company that focus on those things. And sometimes there are not, and you end up kind of wearing that hat as a PM. Or you could be in a nice position where you don't. What should I say? Nice. You might welcome doing those things, but if you don't, you could be in a position where you don't have to worry about it too much, right? There's going to be a marketing team that's going to think about how to actually communicate the value proposition out to, you know, users. But even in those cases, I think as a PM, you still have that very first. You're sort of like, you know, marketing. V0, if you will, like, you know what I mean. Like you still owe that marketing team like the knowledge transfer of like trying to communicate to them effectively what the value prop is, and you know why you're targeting a particular customer segment and all of that. Then they can take it, of course, and figure out how to actually convert that into some kind of marketing strategy and comms strategy and so forth, right? Yeah,
this is actually this is very related to something I've noticed, which makes me a little suspicious that product manager isn't a real job, which is that it seems super dependent what the product manager does on the personnel available in the organization. That if you have them, like what you're saying, if you have someone who's good at marketing, then the product manager won't do marketing. But if you don't, then they will, you know. And, you know, I think you wouldn't expect for a product manager to do software development, but for me, you would. So it's like, well, what would I not be doing? Maybe is a fair question if I was to be a product manager.
Yeah, I mean, it's if you know read, go out there and start reading more and more about product management, you will see these quotes very consistently, things like all of the responsibility, none of the authority, kind of those kinds of things. Some people will go so far as to say you're like the mini CEO. That's a very hotly debated topic because I personally don't think that's a great way to think about PM. But it's true that like you can come up with a great strategy and a great you know, PRDs and all these. You can write those to the cows come home, but ultimately you are dependent almost, you know, 100% on unless like you might be in a situation where you can write some product requirements and then actually implement them yourself, but typically that's not the case, and you are going to be reliant on others, which is why, honestly, like one of the most important qualities to have is to be a good storyteller, and that's again something you'll read, I think, pretty consistently out there about like what does it take to be a good PM, because you have to do a lot of convincing. You have to be like the advocate and the cheerleader for that strategy and that product and those features, and convince people that it's worth investing resources in, because typically you're competing against something else that you could be doing, right? That those people could be doing. Or it could be like we don't have somebody to do that marketing, and you're trying to convince the company to hire somebody because your time is better spent doing these other things, right? So it feels like there's always some percentage of your time where you're just in this convincing and selling mode, you know, to try to get the support you need to get your kind of vision fulfilled.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of my questions that I have written down, which is yeah, like how do you gain the confidence of the leadership that you're not going to be able to get anything done if they don't trust you, right? They're just going to be second guessing you, trying to, and I think that another sort of piece that I want to specifically go into is that usually product managers, sometimes you have a product manager who already is an expert in the domain, already knows all the competitors and all the tools available. Sometimes you get that, but usually I don't think you would expect that. You'd expect that someone comes in who's sort of doesn't really know that much about it. Like me, I don't know that much about like the area that we're in, which is like energy, by the way. Sort of irrelevant to some degree. But how do you convince people that you know enough to make the right choices, I guess?
I think you're right that certainly if we only hired people into product management that had domain expertise, it would be a lot harder to find those people, and maybe those people who really have a ton of domain expertise, maybe they don't want to do product management. So finding that can be tough. So for example, at Google, we're very, when we hire PMs, I think maybe cloud is an exception where domain expertise is kind of important from day one because of the competitive environment they're in, and they expect, for example, somebody who's going to be leading an area like security, really, they can't afford to wait for that person to ramp up. But in general, we hire good generalists, and that's the guidance. And I don't think we're unique at Google in this way. That you hire a good generalist with this expectation that, sure, there's going to be ramp up for them to learn a new domain, but they have shown their ability to do that. And of course, if they're just starting out in product management, maybe they haven't shown that as a PM yet, but they've shown it in other ways that they can talk about in their career, or in their schooling, right? So even if I were to interview an associate product management manager just coming out of school, I'd be looking at their resume and asking them questions about, tell me about a time when you were, needed to kind of start from ground zero on a new topic and how you went about kind of information gathering. And you'll hear people say, I went out and found a few subject matter experts and I interviewed them, kind of like we're doing right now. And you see that, people know how to learn, right? And if you see evidence that people know how to learn and they've done it effectively in their prior life, then you have sort of make a leap of faith that they can do it as a PM for you, right? That's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah, and I guess then the other piece of the puzzle is sort of on the management, whoever's in charge of the product manager, to give them enough slack to, hang themselves if that's what they end up doing. Because if you don't let people make mistakes, then they're not really going to grow anyway, right?
That's true. But I do think, being a manager of PMs who are just starting out, it is something that takes some time to learn how to do it effectively. Not, like you said, like give them some room, but not micromanage. Hopefully be able to give them the right kind of what we could call starter projects, right? So like you don't put too much pressure on them in the beginning. And but you mentioned earlier, like building trust and credibility. There is, as a good PM, right, you realize like, yeah, I need to do that as well. Like this is great that maybe people are going to give me some space to fail and some space to ramp up, but I also need to quickly show that I am like headed in the right direction for this team. And so you look for small wins, right? Like maybe there's a project that's already in flight that you don't need to worry about defining it from scratch, but you can come in and just sort of that, overused term like roll your sleeves up or whatever, and just sort of how can I help, right? That's another thing that I think differentiates people who are considered good PMs is like they don't worry about whose job it is to do something and just sort of like assume it's their job and they just do it. And so that might be like, okay, we're in this meeting, no one seems to be taking notes, I'm just going to take notes, because that seems like the right thing to do. Or I'm going to, create a mock-up because we don't have a UX person on this project, and, everybody would get a benefit from being able to visualize this better, right? So I think you start to do little things like that, and that really starts to help build some credibility and trust that you are like, kind of a team player and willing to do whatever it takes, and then I think you get more and more kind of trust and responsibility, on your plate by doing that.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And I mean, also just some time, you work with people more, and as long as you do a decent job, they'll just start to trust you more, unless you like really mess it up. But assuming it's fine, just some time also will do the trick.
That's a great point. And I think that honestly, like that's one of the things that I think has changed in the last couple of years with the more virtual work. Obviously, like this is the way we're working now, most of us. I think it comes down to like your personal style and how you build relationships, and because that's where trust starts, right? Of course, as you just said, like you showing results is certainly part of it, but I also think like making a kind of personal working connection with somebody, and it is important, especially at the beginning of kind of working relationship, and that's couldn't be more important as a PM. So for me, like personally, if I were working at a company that said we're 100% virtual, first question I would ask is, okay, but do you guys get together like maybe once a quarter to sort of have some good quality time where you're co-located? Because I do think as a PM, that's pretty critical. I would always want that to establish good working relationships with the people that I'm going to be working with a lot. Because even if you only see them, once a quarter for a few days, like the value of that, I think will extend into the next few months when you don't see them. You just see them on the screen, right? And you do a lot of, or you're in different time zones. You're doing a lot of like collaboration where it's not even in real time at all, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. So I have a question about So I guess one problem that I'm having is that, I run out of work as the developer, and to me that's like sound the alarm, like emergency, because the developers are often the biggest cost for a company, and if they're not producing value, that's like red alert status for the company in terms of just wasting money, right? I should not be just relaxing on the company dollar, given that they're paying me well, or even if I wasn't, it still would be a huge waste. So I see the cost of not doing something as being super high, but one sense that I get is that people who are higher up also see the cost of making a mistake as super high. And so there's this sort of tension, I guess, I've been seeing between, I'm like, oh, we should just do something. It doesn't matter what, we'll learn regardless, compared to people sort of on the other side saying like, oh, but if we make a mistake, it could cost us user trust potentially, or it could, send us in a wrong direction just in general in terms of not, being in line with the company's goals and mission, stuff like that. Is this something you've sort of run into, had to deal with at times? Wondering.
Yeah, it is. I mean, certainly I would just at the beginning, I would say the general fear of like not having a good, healthy backlog for the engineering team that you're working with is kind of like, I would live in fear of that. Like, and it does happen occasionally, right? Even though in a perfect world you have like a really well-groomed backlog of stuff that, well-groomed, by well-groomed I mean like well-vetted and prioritized, and right. But in reality, because sometimes you get so busy, you might have something kind of waiting in the wings, but then the team you're working with moves faster than you thought, and you get to that thing, and it was just kind of a one-liner. Like you really didn't get to put much thought into it, and all of a sudden now you're on the hot seat to sort of like, okay, what do you really mean by this? And you're like, oh my gosh, I haven't really thought about that for 6 months, and all of a sudden it becomes an issue. So definitely I share that concern about what you said. You want to keep this very important and expensive resource like well occupied. I think the other thing you said about management, worried about doing the wrong thing, I think that is more of kind of a philosophical thing, right? And I think it depends on the different management teams will have different philosophies, right? And I think personally I think that you need a healthy mix of like, at Google, and this isn't unique to Google, but it's something, I'm sure you remember from Google, it's like this sort of 70-20-10 might be the sort of how do you balance the work that like your team is doing, and it's this notion that like some pretty healthy percentage of it is like, let's say 70% is that sort of business as usual, like we're just churning out the features that are very much like what our customers need right now, and then you've got this sort of other percentage that's a little bit more further out, and then some percentage like 10% that might be very, very exploratory. That's stuff that's very likely to fail as the moonshotty kind of stuff. And so I think if I think as long as there's some agreement from across the company as to like this is how we make our engineering investments, then there's this expectation that some amount of our time is going to be exploratory and it's going to be expected not to pay off, but it's important that we use that time as well. Now that's not exactly what you asked, because I think you were asking, like you were saying, we're only going to do that maybe because we ran out of the 70%. What I'm saying, I guess, is like we should assume that we have a good mix, and that way, even if we ultimately want to end up with the 70-20-10 kind of split, at any point in time, like maybe people now, okay, you know what, we're going to sort of spend more time on the 20% because our PM is like needs another week to kind of really firm up the stuff in the 70% that we should work on next, right? Does that help?
No, I think that's a really good insight that, deciding to work on something that's risky is just tangential from having work to do at all. Those are not tied together necessarily. That, I think that's a very good insight for me because, I think I'm sort of just like, we should do something, but it is reasonable to say if we don't know what our mix is and we don't know what the 70% even should be, then maybe doing something could just be more counterproductive, more against the company values than doing nothing, literally,
That's true. And of course, now you might be not in this position based on the maturity of your product, but of course, typically you have a pretty big bug backlog as well. And so if you didn't have a crisply defined new feature to work on from the PM, you will hopefully always have some work that you could be doing that's still very valuable, like tech debt kind of pay down, and that's never a bad thing.
We don't have any customers yet, so that's definitely one of our big struggles. Leads into sort of my next question, which is more forward-looking, I guess, which is what types of techniques do you like for discovering like what the customers need?
I can think of a few, but certainly the most important is talking with them. Which the only I guess the only worry there is just that you talk to too few of them and you make big decisions based on too few data points, and that can be pretty easy to do when you're in a startup where you have maybe very few customers, but they're paying you, so there's this expectation that you're going to deliver what they want. In a perfect world, right, you would have more customers you could go talk to, and you could sort of use that 80-20 kind of rule, right, where you're like, okay, I've talked to a bunch of people, I seem to be hearing some common themes, I'm going to figure out as a PM, working with my engineering team, how to solve, most of what they want, and so with the sort of broadest applicability across all my customers. May not be exactly what all of them were asking for, but we figured out a way to sort of, normalize the thing they're asking for, or make it more applicable to more customers, more use cases. So certainly talking to them. Another thing would be looking at the competition. Obviously, again there the risk is that you're making an assumption that just because the competition's doing it, like it's the right thing to do, which may be a bad assumption. Typically, but at least it's a starting point to kind of give you ideas and to test, with maybe talking to customers and looking at competitors kind of jointly to say, well, let me back up a step. I would, personally, I wouldn't go to a customer and just ask them, do you want feature A, B, and C? Like, let's say my competitor has feature A, B, and C. I wouldn't necessarily want to go to my customer and ask them, do you want these three features? Because 99% of the time they'll say, yes, of course. Like, maybe some of them will be very honest and say, I don't really have a need for that. Especially if there's something else that they really want you to do and they have an understanding that you can't do everything and they don't want you to be distracted. So they're going to, no, I don't care about that. I want this other thing. But generally, people are going to just think, of course I want that. Why wouldn't I? I can imagine I might want that, to use that sometime. So that's not the strategy I would use. I typically use that kind of more probing interview style where it's like, tell me about your day, tell me about how you approach this particular business problem when you have to do X, Y, and Z. How do you do it? Talk me through it, walk me through it, show me how you do it today. Let me sit next to you and watch over your shoulder as you do it. And can we record your screen? Can I take notes? Can I take some photos? And basically you're trying to essentially kind of make this map, whether you end up doing it visually or at least you start with it in your mind of that journey that they have today to address their particular need. And then you're looking for where the friction points are, where the pain points are, right? That you think you can solve better with your software. So yeah, I mean that's at the core. That's like as basic as it gets, right? And hopefully you can do that with multiple customers because otherwise, as I said earlier, you're going to be, I think, overly your opinion is going to be sort of overly weighted by one voice that can be very loud. But I do think typically, at least in the enterprise world, I don't know what the N is, but it's probably pretty small. Like if people do generally do the same thing for their job and you talk to half a dozen of them, you should start to hear some pretty common themes, right? I would say.
Yeah, that makes sense for sure. Yeah, I've definitely read a little bit about being a product manager. They definitely said the product manager should be the expert on the customers, the customer expert. So that's what goes along a lot with what you're saying, knowing what they're doing and how they're doing it and how the product fits into that as, realistically not that big of a piece in a lot of cases, that the product usually is just a means to get where they need to go in a lot of cases, rather than something that they're super passionate about that's like the end game.
Right.
Maybe for like a consumer product it's more of like the end game. It's like I got the iPhone, but for a lot of stuff, especially B2B stuff, it's like, oh, you're just solving a problem that we have that we could solve ourselves, but it's a lot better for someone else to do it because you can do it in a better way. Yeah.
Right. Now, the other part of it, I guess I would think about, you're talking to customers, you're kind of mapping out their journeys, looking for problems, is that realistically they're not, your application is not operating in a vacuum, right? So there is that point where you want to understand the other systems that you're likely going to be required to integrate with. Whether it's obviously stuff like platforms that, I need half my customers use iOS and half use Android or whatever it might be. But more typically, it's like, I know that for my product to work well, there is this particular repository of user information or whatever that we don't own, but we're expected to be able to interface with it. So it's pretty important that I, as a PM, understand the kind of interface there. Not that I'm going to be writing the code to integrate with that interface, but I need to be able to speak intelligently about like what will it actually fulfill, like does the data model of that repository sort of provide the data we're going to need, or am I going to actually have to reach out to that vendor and try to create some sort of partnership to do what I want to do? Like I need some support from some other company, right? So that's where you start to get into, say, a little bit more complicated kind of landscape, and typically, unless you're in you're in a big company that has some sort of bargaining power is the wrong term, but like you're in a position where you can go to another enterprise vendor and actually influence their roadmap, you're likely stuck with you go out and you see what APIs those guys have and what data they how the data flows, and you just are responsible to work with what they have. You're not usually in a position to influence that too much when you're just getting started. But you may have a joint customer where you can kind of use that leverage, and that does happen, right? Where you realize to fulfill what you want to do in your company, you do have to leverage some important customer relationship and say, hey, we could give you this awesome value and cut down your end-to-end time to complete this process by 50%, but we're going to need this additional piece of data from this other vendor you use. And so let me write this up, how we could achieve this, and let's jointly go to that vendor, and you as their customer can probably make this happen, right? And we can all have a joint win, So those kinds of things are kind of realistically come up in the enterprise world especially.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I saw also a lot was just between teams in the same company, there can be a lot of that same sort of thing of like, oh, is this really that important to us? Well, it's important to that team, so maybe it is important, That seems like a pretty even more common situation.
That's true. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, this is super helpful. I guess I do have some sort of general questions. Well, okay, I will say one big problem that I have that I just want to bring up because it's relevant, which is that I'm in Denmark, which is where the startup is, and I don't actually speak Danish. So I think that that's sort of my biggest barrier to going deeper into product management at the current time, but I am taking Danish class, so we'll see. We'll see how that goes. But I'm sort of wondering, like, I think some parts, the part about product management that really speaks to me is just doing whatever needs to get done. That's sort of always been the way I've operated. I think that's just the right way to operate in general at, a job, is that if you're not willing to do whatever needs to get done, then you're just not that good of a team player, Not that I mean, I've worked with lots of people who don't do whatever needs to get done. It's not like I look down on them, but the best people who I've worked with, I would say, are the people who, just do whatever has to get done. So that definitely really speaks to me, that's one of like the core sort of competencies of being a product manager. But I guess I'm sort of wondering, what's like the bad stuff? Why should I not want to be a product manager?
I do think that, you need to be able to accept failure and kind of let things roll off your back, if you will, and not everybody can do that. I personally, just to be honest, I struggle with that, because I'm fairly sensitive and take things personally, but you can't really do that realistically and stay in this role and be happy because there's, as we were saying earlier, right there, you are reliant on so many people, and you could give a valiant effort to try to get something prioritized and try to get the resources for it, and maybe it just can't happen. You're unable to make that happen. Well, if you go back to the customer or the partner that you were trying to do this for, and you have to deliver that bad news, hopefully they're not going to blame you, but you might feel personally somehow responsible, right? Like, I failed you, Mr. Customer, and you really can't do that too much, or it's going to just eat away at you. But so that is a negative thing about the job, is you do have to say no a lot, and you do have to sort of deliver bad news a lot. If you didn't, that would be an amazing position to be in. You could just say yes to everything and make it all happen, but that's realistically not the case. I would say another aspect of it is just the fact that you might love the part of the job where you get to work with your engineering team, and just, that great kind of synergy that you get into and flow state you get into. Maybe you have what they call the triad, where it's like your engineering team and you and a UX team, and you just get into a room and you ideate, you churn stuff out, you get good feedback, and everything's hunky-dory. But ultimately, there's a level of overhead, I think, that comes with the job, which is like a lot of communication. I talked earlier about constantly advocating for your thing and trying to get resources. And so there's always bubbling under, I don't know what percentage of your job it is, probably varies depending on the company, but some percentage of your job is just okay, I have to go again to do a quarterly business review with my leadership, or I need to, I don't know, they're going to send me out to some investor thing. And, so there's those things that just become part of the job. And again, they're going to vary wildly, depending on the size of the company and where you are, the maturity of your product. But if you don't, you might just have to that's part of the gig, and I have to deal with it. I don't love it, but the other parts of the job are fulfilling enough that I understand there's this overhead and just things I have to do. But those, to your question about why should I not want to do it, or what would I not enjoy? I think for some PMs it's that stuff that's feels a little bit like noise sometimes, but it's just part of what you need to do, right? So that's the first thing that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And then maybe you could talk a little about like what the product manager like career trajectory looks like to you. Like what does that look like? I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one because I think definitely seen a lot of different career paths that people take where, you'll see some person and you'll read their bio and they'll say, oh, they started out as a PM for 5 years or 10 years at these companies and now they're, I don't know, maybe they're a venture capitalist or, maybe they're, I don't know, like working in some completely different domain. Certainly there is the career PM kind of approach where, you just get more scope or you become a manager of other PMs and a director and maybe a VP and you sort of stay in that world. You see people become sort of more like what we would maybe call a general manager. So that's where, you kind of run a whole business unit where you're ultimately responsible for the profit and loss of that business unit, and under you kind of have all the functions for that business unit, including engineering and marketing and all these. Well, marketing might end up being like a centralized function at the company, so maybe that's a bad example. But generally, at least you have like product and engineering under you, and that can be a pretty common career path because as a PM, you do, as we were saying earlier, you do sort of see all the parts of what it takes from the strategy through to the fruition and marketing and sales of your product. So I think if you are seen as being someone who has knowledge about that breadth of stuff, that could make you a good general manager if you have an interest in that kind of thing. And then I think there are, you don't typically see PMs become engineers. We usually see the other direction, but I suppose it's possible if you either had gone to school for that or you are so excited you want to go back to school for that. So I typically don't see people going from PM to other functions within a software organization too much. It does tend to be the other way around. So I think I tend to see more like some of the other paths I mentioned, which is more just becoming more of a senior leader within a company. And it might be, I mentioned general manager. It also might be, depending on the company, it might be like, marketing actually is a good one. So I have seen people go from product management into product marketing because they realize what really they get excited about is that sort of top of the funnel part of sort of figuring out more like marketing and strategy. And even though I mentioned earlier that a PM has a vital role in that, at certain large companies, there are people who focus on that. So they do a lot of analytics and sort of figure out underserved market segments and then how to connect with those segments. And so that is a common thing that I've seen is people go into kind of marketing and strategy as well.
So I have one more question, maybe the most important question. When someone says PM, am I just allowed to assume it's a product manager, or could it also be a program manager?
Yeah, that's a great question because it gets confused all the time, in my opinion. So I mean, to the point where I am even nervous about just using the abbreviation PM to identify myself in an email. Now at Google, I think it's pretty well understood, but maybe not by everybody, and maybe not by noodlers and newbies. So I tend to write out product manager. But I have certainly heard people refer to me as project manager, program manager, when they're introducing me in a meeting or something like that, or they have expectations that I am all of the above because I use the term PM, or they just don't know what it is. So even though you might think that people know what the role is, what I have found is, especially when you're working with people that are pretty new, right? Just out of school, or maybe they worked at a company that didn't really have product management as a well-defined discipline. You learn that you shouldn't assume. So it can be a good thing when you first meet somebody that you're going to be working with. You might even just sort of learn by asking them some questions about their background. I might ask so what is in the past, what's your relationship been with with product management? And by asking that, you're sort of starting to uncover we didn't really have PMs at my last team, so we relied on X, Y, and Z or whatever. And at least you get a sense of how much education you might need to give them, or sort of more direction on well, this is really what the value I'm going to add. And even though we said earlier that you kind of need to do everything, you may want to. There may be a caveat there where maybe for a particular person you're working with, you want to make it clear, oh, by the way, I don't do this one thing, just so you don't have they don't have the wrong expectation, right, for you that you're gonna, I don't know, go. I can't think of a good example. Go do something that you just want to make sure they're not waiting for that from you. Now, in a perfect world, if you're going to give that message, oh, by the way, I am not going to be the one creating the dependency mapping. Hopefully, if you're going to give that message to somebody, you're going to say, and by the way, it's this person who I'm going to invite to the next meeting because that's their role. And then you're just kind of up-leveling everybody's understanding of roles and responsibilities. But yeah, I would not be surprised if people mess it up. And yeah, you kind of do have to educate people.
You solved the problem for me, though, which is the problem. It doesn't matter what kind of PM you are. What matters is the expectations for what you're going to do. That's what matters. And so then I don't even care, because for me, I'm all well, if you start doing good stuff for me, I'm not going to complain regardless of what it is, because all I'm doing is whatever needs to get done anyway. So if you start doing some of that, then it's great. So maybe the true answer for me is I don't care. I don't care which kind of PM you are, as long as you're doing useful stuff for me.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.